Experimental research is one of the most important types of research in social sciences. We have some previous lectures in this space on the definition and types of experimental research. The current presentation aims to identify some of the strengths and some of the challenges that social science researchers can face when they try to conduct experimental studies. So let us first begin with a brief definition of what experimental research is. So as the very name suggests, experimental research is a method of scientific inquiry where the focus is on making or conducting experiments. The aim of those experiments is actually to establish cause and effect relationships by manipulating one or more independent variables and observing their impact on the dependent variables. So generally in experimental studies, we deal with variables, and especially we deal with finding out possible relationships or impacts of some variables on some other variables. Generally this happens in a controlled environment. So in contrast to other types of research, especially in social sciences, the experimental research studies generally need to be conducted in an environment where there is some control of some variable. The focus of experimental research then is also on testing hypotheses or educated guesses related to relationships or impacts of variables on other variables. And so on the basis of data, either that support our hypotheses or that reject our hypotheses, we get to certain conclusions on the basis of an analysis of empirical data. Generally, experimental research is conducted both in natural and social sciences, although it is more associated with natural sciences, mainly because most natural sciences follow the positivist school of thought with quantitative research designs. So now moving on to the strengths of mentioning the strengths of experimental research. So why is it that generally experimental studies are considered quite authentic in some cases in comparison to other types of research? The first important thing about this is that experimental studies generally establish cause and effect relationships or causal relationships. So generally, as we know that establishing cause-effect relationships is an important aspect of the process of scientific inquiry, because this type of research allows researchers to establish clear cause and effect relationships in a controlled environment where certain variables are controlled and certain variables are tested. So that's the first thing. That is one of the strengths that it helps us in establishing cause and effect relationships. Secondly, experimental research helps us or enable us to have control over certain variables of interest. Generally, for example, variables that might have impact on our dependent variables, but in experimental studies, we try our best to make sure that there is control over extraneous variables or variables that are not directly of interest to our studies. And so minimizing the impact of those extraneous variables that might have possible implications is something that helps us in making the experimental research more authentic. In comparison to other studies such as the observational studies. The other strength of experimental research is that they give us this ability to replicate our studies. So replicability is something that gives strength to experimental research, because the structure and nature of experiments makes it easier for us as researchers to replicate. Those experiences are well structured, and there are certain set procedures that we need to follow, and we need to record those set procedures. As a result, the process of research could be replicated under similar conditions with the expectations that we will get similar results. So this actually enhances the reliability and generalizability of our research. And as we know that generalization is one of the aims of scientific research, so that's why experimental research is considered as a strong type of research. The other strength is that experimental studies help us in becoming more precise and objective in our approach to scientific studies. So as in most experiments, the nature of data is quantitative, discrete, and this actually leads to more precision in terms of measurement, in terms of evaluations, and in terms of quantification. And this also helps in reducing researcher bias. So both of these things aid to the authenticity of the research process. Then innovative insights. Experimental researches are generally based on our hypotheses or educated guesses. So once we conduct this generally authentic process of research in social sciences, this is something that helps us provide better insights into human behavior, into societal trends related to certain issues. And these insights are more informed because these kind of things might not be obvious or evident just on the basis of our observations. So we might be observing certain things, and we might have certain prejudgments or certain hypotheses. But once we conduct experiments on those hypotheses or educated guesses, and we quantify the phenomena under control, in controlled type of environment, we are able to make bigger claims and stronger claims. And lastly, the experimental studies help us in the application of our results in a more practical way. Why? Because findings from experiments can inform policy making, interventions in educational or social programs. So, for example, if you want to initiate new types of teaching methodologies, for example, in a particular educational system, and you conduct experiments related to the effectiveness of particular teaching methods, and the experiments basically tell you that, for example, the educational achievement of students has become better through the use of those particular research teaching methods. That will actually help policymakers in making policies that are based on or informed by concrete experimental research. And so this is something that is a strength of experimental research. Now, experimental research has certain challenges as well, especially in social science context, because social science context generally deals with the human society. So human behaviors, human interactions, human relationships are not as concrete as we see in the natural phenomena or in the natural settings. So the first thing is that experimental researches offer us challenges, including, first of all, ethical concerns. In many cases, manipulating certain variables, especially in social context, for example, manipulating human behaviors, or passing humans through, or even animals through certain experiments, can lead to certain ethical issues. For example, exclusion or physical or emotional impact of certain experiments on humans. For example, if you are conducting some study on children and their behavior in an educational context, and you pass them through certain educational processes just to see, for example, their emotional health or the impact of those experiments on their emotional health or physical health. That is something that could have, in some cases, negative impact on their mental or social health. And as a result, there is this ethical concern that we need to deal with. Secondly, because experiments are not do not generally take place in natural environments, so there is an element of artificiality because of the need for laboratory settings that in many cases might not accurately reflect the real world scenarios, reducing external validity, which actually means that in some cases experimental research might not be generalizable to other context because of the complexity of the human phenomena. Then this one is related to the previous one, the complexity of human behaviors. Human behaviors, because of the complexity of the human brain in comparison to, for example, basic animals or to the natural objects, the human behavior is generally influenced by numerous factors, and it makes it difficult to isolate variables or to generalize findings. So again, because of the complexity of human behaviors, the application of experimental research designs is quite challenging. And then there are other challenges as well. For example, experiments generally need more requirements in terms of time, in terms of funding, in terms of infrastructure. And so making experiments or conducting experiments, especially in human context, is quite resource intensive process. Then in many cases, representation of samples is quite difficult, again mainly because of logistical constraints. Social experiments, for example, may use smaller samples or non-representative samples. Again, this can limit generalizability of the experimental studies. Then certain variables might not be controllable. For example, societal or environmental factors or participants' biases cannot be fully controlled. In some cases, the participants in the experiments, the humans, their behaviors are more complex and so cannot be quantified properly, and that can actually have potential impact on our outcomes. And lastly, the Hawthorne effect actually is that in some cases participants might alter their behavior or change their behavior when they come to know that they are being that they are actually involved in a particular experiment. So their behavior might be quite different from the natural behavior that they might have in a particular natural settings. For example, again, if there is a class of students who are behaving in a particular class in a natural settings, when they know that a particular teacher or researcher are actually conducting some experiments related to a particular teaching method or something in their class, their behavior might change, and so that artificiality might not be representative of their real behavior, and as a result there is this lack of authenticity in this case. So we need to think about these challenges. Also, another challenge could be the researcher's bias. In some cases, the researchers might want to prove or disprove certain hypotheses, and so there might be some data manipulation, or in some cases there might be manipulation in the conduct of the experiments. So experimental research, to conclude, experimental research is one of the most important types of research, one of the most authentic type of research studies, mainly because of the authenticity of the process, mainly because of the controlled environment in which we conduct, and mainly because of the clear measurement of the variables. But experimental research in human sciences or in social sciences also have certain challenges that we need to be very careful about when we are conducting experimental research in social sciences.